So yeah, thanks for that. I was a student here at Stanford many years ago. As Michael said, we actually were same class. I saw him be part of, was it the a cappella group you were part of?
Fleet Street. Yeah.
Fleet Street, yeah. So I saw him do that many times. I studied with a professor named BJ Fogg here. How many people here have taken a class with BJ Fogg or know BJ Fogg's Persuasive Technology Lab? 2 or 3, okay. There's a lab at Stanford called the Persuasive Technology Lab, and it's basically all about applying what we know about psychology to make technology more persuasive. So how could you make technology persuade people to click on a button, or respond to an email, or sign up for a form, or go floss, right? And in that class, what I learned was all of the things that essentially, all the levers you have to kind of tweak human behavior, to tweak choice, to tweak attention. And there was one class on ethics. So we have this tool set now, right? Imagine you're given this tool belt, which is, here are all the ways to tap into people's psychology, right? And you have all these levers. You know you can influence these people. So what ethical code should govern the use of that psychological tool set? And that question has been really interesting to me for a long time. When I was a kid, I was a sleight of hand magician. And that made me very interested in, basically, we don't see the things that we don't see. And there's all these subtle ways that people can be misled, right, without knowing it. And again, there's never been this question about what is the ethics of all of that. And as designers, when you go out there in the world, how many people here are like thinking, how many people are in computer science, like computer science students? Okay. Psychology? 1. What am I missing? Quick shout-outs? Any other fields? Mostly computer science. Many of you are probably going to go out and start companies or work at technology startups, right? And you're going to be in this position where you're in front of millions of people. You're making something that's going to get used by millions of people. And whether you want to or not, you're going to be steering them towards certain kinds of things. You're going to be steering them to do certain things with their time and not others. And so I think, this influence that we have, specifically isolated like in 50-mile radius of where we are right now and at Stanford, is profound. And we don't really talk about what is the fair or good use of that influence or not. And so I'm going to talk a little about that today, and that was just a little bit of an intro. And I also want to say that I'm here also to ask you for help with what I'm going to talk to you about, because this is kind of like, I'll make this metaphor later, but it's kind of like where we were with organic in 1970. And we're just starting to realize there's a different kind of conversation we might want to have about food. I think we're about to have that conversation with technology, and I'd love your help. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. What I see as the problem, some specific design principles that will kind of alleviate some of this, and then also a different kind of system that can manage this. So first, what's the problem? So in my life, I think a lot about where my time goes. I've always been kind of vigilant about where my time goes. I took another class at Stanford a long time ago on existentialism, which profoundly shaped me. We have this one life to live, right? And we're given this one ticket with this one life, and where the hell should we spend our time? And I get really concerned about this because so much of my time gets slipped away to distractions. I just get sucked into stuff, right? If I get a push notification or the little red badge shows up, I'm just going to get sucked in. And if I get an email like this, that I've been tagged in a photo, how many of you have gotten this email like today? Some of you. This is one of the most compelling emails a human being can receive, right? Because your social acceptance and rejection are essentially on the line. So are you going to not respond to this email? No, of course. Except you're not just going to click see photo. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes, right? This happens every time. Or, I'll find myself pulling to refresh my email, and I pull down to refresh. But then 30 seconds later, I'll unlock my phone, and I'll do it again. Why did I do that? Is there really, do I even understand why I did that? I mean, do I expect that there's a new email that came in? Is there something really that would have happened? Just examine that for a second. Why in the world are we doing that? Well, I'll give you a hint why this is happening. What do you think in the United States makes more money than the entire industries of movies, baseball, and game parks combined in the United States? So the answer is slot machines. So slot machines specifically, not casinos, slot machines, which is crazy. How can that be possible? Because it's not like they're playing with $100 bills, right? People are playing slot machines with tiny, tiny bits of change, with coins. But my phone is a slot machine, right? Every time I check my phone, I'm like playing the slot machine to see what did I get, right? Every single time that I pull to refresh my email, I'm playing the slot machine to see what am I going to get. Every time you scroll a news feed, you don't know what's next on the page, so you're playing the slot machine to see what's the next thing on the news feed. This is operating on something many of you might know is a variable schedule reward. In psychology, it's very, very powerful, Pavlovian conditioning, all the stuff that you've heard. But specifically, there's a book called Addiction by Design that Natasha Schull at MIT wrote that talks about how slot machines are so addictive. They're actually 2 to 3 times faster to get people addicted or problematically involved, more so than any other kind of gambling. And that people who are even aware of the dynamics of slot machines, once they understand how it all works, it doesn't break the spell. There's a famous example of a woman named Rose who's a slot machine addict, and she decides, I want to break the spell, so she tries to become a technician of slot machines. And she says, surely if I figure out how slot machines work and I fix them every day, that would like break the problem. But it didn't do anything. She would still go back on her lunch break and play the slot machines the rest of the day. It's incredibly addictive, and it runs her life. And I'll say one more thing about this, which is in 2009, I had lunch with Rebecca Cox, who was the first newsfeed designer of Facebook newsfeed. And many of you may be too young to remember this, but Facebook was not always just the newsfeed. There was a page that you could go to, and it would have a couple notifications, but it didn't have the newsfeed when you first landed there. And she was the designer of it, and she was telling me over lunch that one of the things that made the newsfeed work was a hardware innovation. A hardware innovation. And I was like, what do you mean hardware? There's no hardware on this screen that you've designed. Well, she said, no, it had to do with the ubiquitous introduction of scroll wheels on mice and the double finger scrolling on trackpads. The reason being that when you don't have to move your hand from its resting position to scroll, you can just scroll the trackpad like that, which is the exact same thing, by the way, that they've done with slot machines. They found that you can get people more into the zone if you just put a little button there instead of having a whole lever, because your hand doesn't have to leave its resting position, right? So you're hitting the pellet. So just to really emphasize, your experience with technology is so driven by this mechanic. So I want to say that this is not a new problem. This is something that many people historically have been thinking about for a long time. There's a great book called Amusing Ourselves to Death that this guy Neil Postman wrote, and he compares these two visions of the future. The dystopian vision of the future by George Orwell, who wrote 1984, and the dystopian vision of the future by Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. And he has this great distinction I want to read to you quickly, which is that he says, what Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book because there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we'd be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. In other words, they failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. I really take this into account because I think this is what I've studied the last 10 years. Is essentially, when we say distractions, what we're really failing to take into account is psychology. The way that what's just so seductive to human being psychology that when it shows up, we don't have as much choice, right? And that's what this is about. And one thing we need to acknowledge is that this is not appearing in a vacuum. What are the systemic forces that create this? Well, we live in an attention economy, which means that whether you're building a meditation app to help people meditate, or you're building an informative news website, or you're building an addictive game, you're still competing for attention. You're competing, you win, by getting people to spend time on things. You win by being better at developing a habit, at triggering people, at getting them to come back 3 or 4 times in a week so that they develop a self-habit that they then come back on their own. And the thing is, there's whole industries that are set up to teach people how to do this. BJ Fogg's class at Stanford, books like Captivology, Hooked. These are the core texts you read in some of these classes. And then, of course, there's entire people whose job it is every day to go to work and to find new ways to get you to come back. Literally hundreds of people. So when you're sitting there in front of that screen and you're thinking, I'm not going to scroll down on the newsfeed today, I'm going to really minimize my time, you have to realize that's your prefrontal cortex attempting to set a goal, that's millions of years old hardware, up against a room full of engineers whose job it is to get you to scroll more, right? And there's no evil here, just to be really clear. There's nothing that's wrong with this. This is just the system that we're living in, right? Where we need to get people to spend time. That's how the industry works. So, and it leads us to a kind of race to the bottom of the brainstem to win, right? Because to win means you have to be better at seducing psychology, right? So it's not that, I don't know how many of you know, this is the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. You guys know that? Yeah. So this is a great social cause. It's for the ALS, social cause. But should this be the set of rules that you're forced to win by, right? Should this be the game that you have to play if you want to get people to care about a social cause? So it leaves us in this kind of all or nothing relationship with technology, because we're either on and we're connected, but then we get distracted all the time and sucked in. Or we have to turn it off and we leave our phones at home and we don't, we put it away, right? But in other words, it's kind of a bad menu because we're either distracted or we're missing out on the benefits of technology completely. And that's a really kind of bad menu to live by, right? Let's imagine like being on a diet and someone's only handing you an option of burgers or fries, right? It's just, this is not enough choice. So what we need to do is we need to restore choice. But I want to say something about where that choice has to come from. Because as we just said, there's a bunch of forces that are so seductive to us that this choice is not going to come from willpower or just better habits, right? Because we kind of know the limits of that. What we need is better design. And in terms of resisting this stuff, even resisting a blinking notification light or resisting scrolling when you know that you kind of feel compelled to scroll, that takes energy. Everything depletes this sort of conscious decision-making energy. There's a bunch of research by this guy, Roy Baumeister, at Florida State University, who's shown that our choice-making, our conscious choice-making energy is sort of finite in a day. And so if you're putting choices in front of people, you're depleting the store of conscious choice-making energy that they have available, which means that everything that you consider or resist is depleting this battery. So the more notifications you're sending people, the more emails someone has to receive and think about, right? There's a lot of ways to kind of overload people. And so as a designer, you're designing both kinds of choices. You're designing the conscious choices and how you put those in front of people, but you're also designing what's left over. So when someone's just running on autopilot and this sort of unconscious system 1 mode, you're basically choosing for them, whether you want to or not. You're putting the groove lines in the ground so that when people are walking, they just follow the groove line, right? Does that make sense? So there's conscious choice making and unconscious choice making, and you're designing both as a designer. And you have to make choices, like what choices should I put in front of you that should be conscious? Which ones should be automatic that I don't prompt you for? Which ones are just the groove lines of how the world works? And to give you a sense of how deep this might be, given what we know about modern psychology, which preferences should we honor? Netflix has there's a group at Netflix, or there's a guy at Netflix who had studied the taste profiles of a user. And I don't know how many of you remember, but Netflix used to be this service where you would put online what you wanted, and then 4 days later you got a DVD in the mail. So this is the DVDs in the mail service for Netflix. And what this person found was that if you took a user who got DVDs in the mail from this version of Netflix, and then you activated them as an instant watch user, so they switched to being able to watch whatever they want instantly, what they found is that the person's taste profile shifted. Meaning, before they wanted to watch documentaries or, action movies or whatever they were really into. And then when they got instant watch, suddenly they wanted to watch like Family Guy and comedies or other stuff, right? So why would that be the case? Well, in one case, you're choosing for your future self. And the other case, you're choosing for your instant, immediate self. And it's like different people. It's the same thing as in behavioral economics, where they found that if you take a person who's really hungry and you go to the grocery store when you're really hungry, you walk home with not just less healthy food, but more food, versus if you walk into the grocery store when you're totally sated and you're not hungry. So there's not even one consistent human being to design for. There's a multitude of selves inside all of us. And how do we as technology designers honor or ask or elicit the values of all of those different selves that we're designing for? Who are we designing for? So I want to bring those up as sort of the frame for then saying, well, what does it mean then to design something to be on someone's team, to help them spend their time well? And so our choices are always situated. There's no such thing as just this free, uninfluenced choice. There's no such thing as an uninfluenced choice. There's only choices that are situated or influenced by a moment, and the framing of the choice, the moment of the choice, what else is surrounding the context of that choice. And our choices, therefore, are only as good as the menus that we put in front of people to make them. And you, as the designers of the technology, are the menu designers. You're creating the menus. OK, so I'm just going to leave it at that. So what are some design principles in the face of this frame of the problem? So one thing that I want to shift is that when we're designing products, we're not just designing a product and assuming free choices, that people are just going to express free choices with the product. We're designing the relationship that a person has with the product. We're designing the situation that a person has or is in when they're making choices with the product. So what that means is that I think our role as product designers, we often think, I'm just going to build an app, right? And however often they go to the app, or they check the app, or they do something is totally up to the user, and I don't influence that. Well, I'm saying, no, let's shift that. What if we had a responsibility as designers for the relationship you have with the product? And to do that, we need to acknowledge the blind spots of psychology. We need to acknowledge these real forces that variable schedule rewards, or social acceptance or rejection, or the sort of things that we're not necessarily aware of that are driving a lot of the behavior we have. So as designers, we have to inoculate people in a way, or give them behavioral antibodies for these things that show up. And so what I want to talk about is what would make a good relationship, and how do you design to give people choice over these aspects of their relationship. I'm going to talk about a few today. I'll try to rush through them because I want to make sure we have time for questions. So the first one is being able to bound your relationship. So there's a famous behavioral economics study where if you give a bunch of people, you ask a bunch of people to sit down at a table, and you say, there's a bunch of soup bowls on the table with soup in them, and you just ask people to sit down and eat. And what the participants don't know is that some of the bowls of soup actually have a tube underneath them, and as they're eating, it's refilling the bowl with more soup. And so we think that how much soup we eat is a matter of choice, right? Like, I'm in control of how much I eat. And this study basically showed that it's not true, that basically people who had the bottomless bowls didn't know when to stop. They underestimated how much they'd eaten by like 170 calories. They ate 76% more soup. And they were no more sated or less hungry than the other group. So, and the way you get around this is, and the reason I mention this is because a lot of the technology we use looks like bottomless bowls, right? These feeds that just kind of go on forever. And they're designed like that for a reason, as we know. But the way you fix this is you give people back a choice about how big a bowl they want. You let them set the bottom of their bowl. You let them say how big a plate you want before you go into the buffet. You give them a choice about the medium or the relationship they're going to have with these food choices. So what would that look like with technology? Well, imagine you showed up in your email, this is an idea, and it asked you, it took responsibility for the relationship. How much time do you want to spend on email today? And then it was on your team to spend that time that way. Right? Or what if you could mark a website that you particularly wish you spent a little bit less time on and wanted to be more mindful of your usage? And what if you could say, hey, I want to mark that website, so when I go there, it gives me this little feedback of how often I've been there today and how much time I've actually been there, right? And maybe at the beginning of the day, it asked me how big a plate size do I want today of that website that I use a lot, and I would say, oh, I want 30 minutes. And the next time that I go there and I've gone there past, maybe it shows up in yellow, so it activates System 1 intuitive processing, makes me a little bit more aware of what I'm doing with technology. It's reflecting back that usage to me. And then maybe ask me for a confirmation to go there when I'm over that 30 minutes or something. So this is technology that's taking responsibility for the boundedness of your relationship with it. So another one is timeliness. So it's not just a matter of something being good or bad. It's about, well, when did it show up in my life, right? There's things that I really like doing. I just don't like doing them now. And there's different design patterns that reflect this. So one of them is reflected in things like Mailbox or Inbox by Google, where you can snooze a message. So yes, I want to respond to that email, but I want to respond to it later, right? Or if you've used things like Pocket or Instapaper, yes, I want to read that article, but I want to do it later. So this it gives me choice over the relationship I have with things. I'm not in this all or nothing, I have to read it now, or I have to let it burden me sitting as a tab open in my browser for 2 weeks while I know I'm not going to get to it, right? So timeliness is another big factor. You can also do it in batch. So there's Google Gmail tabs lets you basically push off certain categories of email, so you can check your social messages on a different frequency than you check all the other stuff. These are ways of time shifting things both individually, manually, and in batch. So this is a design principle you can follow. Another one is the separability of a relationship. So this is actually represented in the same Gmail example where you're allowed to separate out these different types of things that you're after, right? Right now with your email, unless you're using this, you have to look at everything all at once. You're forced to consider all these different parts of your life all in one list, right? You're not allowed to separate them. Or if you go to Facebook and you are just interested in going to events, right, and looking up an event, well, you can't just do that. You have to go through the front door where they put the newsfeed in front of you, right? So you're not allowed to separate. So one design pattern would be to enable people to separate out the activities or intentions that they want to do. This is something that Mailbox does when you want to compose a message. It separates out this task, enabling you to focus more on just that. But it's an important thing to consider designing for. How can I help the user separate out the things they want to do from the things that they wouldn't want to do, and be more conscious of that? And I'll go through that later. Related to that is a design principle which I call intention first. So in the relationship, does it ask me for an intention first before just offering me the salad bar or the sugar dessert bar of everything that it offers? So I have this joke where on my laptop I often put a little sticky that says, "Do not open without an intention," right? How would you make some surface or some product an intention-first product? Well, do you ever open your phone and just kind of notice you swipe through 2 screens, swipe back 2 screens, and turn off your phone? You guys do that? This is sort of not an intention-first interface, right? It's a browse-first, dessert-based, just here's some stuff-based interface. Imagine though, or you go to Gmail to compose a message and you want to compose a message, but then you're not given the ability to just do that. You have to go to the doorway of seeing all your email first, right? That's not really an intention-first interface. Or as we mentioned, you have a need like, oh, I need to look up Joe's number, and so you go to Facebook to do that, but then you get sucked into the news feed. So these are not intention-first interfaces. And so an intention-first interface would be one that controls for the intention that you have coming in and also the intention you have going out. So does the person leak from their intention when trying to get to the thing they were trying to do before, or do they leak after? So a couple examples of this are on your phone. This is sort of a combination of habits and design patterns. What I do when I want to launch an app, for example, is I unlock my phone and then instead of scrolling through the apps, I just pull down and type the thing I'm looking for, because that's letting me express the intention of what I want. Or if you use a voice command, you say, hey Siri, I want to do this, or Google Now, right? It speaks to the value of these kinds of interfaces because they let you express what you want before you get sidetracked to something else. So this prevents the in-leakage part we were talking about. There's things like Spotlight on OS X or Quicksilver that do this as well. This was an example of that as well. It's letting you set an intention first when you first arrive in your email. Oops, sorry. This is out of order. These are examples of the out leakage. So Netflix, because they're part of the attention economy and want to maximize the attention, how many of you have been in the situation where you finish an episode and it tries to autoplay in 5 seconds, right? So this is an out leakage because your intention, we don't know what your intention was, but it's certainly pushing more strongly to leak you into the next thing as opposed to an interface which bounded your intention. It created a conscious choice or an active choice there. Or things like Vimeo, when you go to watch a video on Vimeo, it just shows you the video, right? There's not this intentional sidebar that's trying to take you out. It just focuses on what you wanted to watch, and that's reflected in the incentives that Vimeo has. And YouTube is a little bit different because there's the incentive to keep watching more videos. So there's a little bit more out leakage with YouTube. And then another thing that makes a good relationship is reducing psychic costs, or what I call psychological externalities in an interface. Peace of mind, anxiety-free. So a lot of you might feel a lot of times, again, like I just got to turn off, right? I'm going to turn off my phone because I just can't have it with all this stuff. And of course you can't do that because you freak out and say, well, what if I miss something important? What if that important phone call comes in and mom wants to call me before finals? What if something happened with my kids? I have to be connected. So you're always worried about missing something important. But that's a psychological externality. It's this open loop that I'm going to be worried about until there's a better design. And so it keeps us on this treadmill. And there's different design features to alleviate this. iOS 8 lets you, for example, say for a given email thread that you want to receive notifications on that email thread, so you know that you can basically turn off all your email notifications by default, but then have certain ones that say if my boss or my girlfriend emails me back on this thread, I want to know about it, and you can have a separate way of getting notifications on that. Or know that you don't have to check your email consciously to see if your boss responded, because Boomerang has this option. Boomerang is a Gmail extension that lets you say, if I don't hear back, please boomerang this message in a week. These are different examples of essentially things that reduce the psychological externalities. Or if you're in a how many of you go to dinner with a friend and you know that you have to leave in like an hour and a half, right? Except what you do is you leave your phone there so that every 10 seconds you can kind of check to see, is it an hour and a half yet? Like, you want to make sure you don't miss your time to leave. So a different choice would be to basically set the alarm and put it away with confidence, knowing that it's going to call you back. So it's moving from a pull-based to a push-based type model. But you can design with that in mind and enable people to disconnect, right? You can give them back the freedom and the ability to disconnect without worry that they're missing something important. And that's what a lot of these smartwatch type things are trying to do as well, is basically give you the confidence and security without the worry of like the phantom buzz phenomenon, right? Where you're worried that you might have missed something on your phone, so you have to pull it out all the time. One of the benefits of having wearable technology is the idea that you get a salient notification that you won't miss if something important comes in. That's one of the promises of that kind of technology. And then another thing that makes a good relationship is how good it is at reflecting back to you. Does it care about showing its impact in your life? So many of the technologies we use do take on in its responsibility in the design the need to reflect back to you what your relationship with it is, right? So in a car, speedometers or odometers. What if you had something like that for your phone, right? What if there was something that when you unlocked your phone, it gave you some kind of feedback about your use of it, and when you spiked, it maybe showed you that. If this is something you would want, you'd have to demand that. But we have things like that with speed limits, right, where we flash the flashing speed limit sign. We could do that in browsers, where we could be better at reflecting back to you where you spent your time. That's something that in design of an application that you make, you could do that. You can reflect back to people their use in the Omnibox. There's all sorts of examples. You can also reflect back more honestly the costs of a kind of choice. So Medium, for example, you guys know Medium is the online publishing site. They actually reflect back the reading time, so that you can make a more conscious or honest choice before clicking on it. These are just different examples of reflecting back information about what you're about to do. Calorie counts on menus. In general, reflection can modify choice if it's integrated into the moment of choice. And one thing to say about this is things like Rescue Time, if many of you use it. Did anybody here know what Rescue Time is? Rescue Time is a service that you install, and it basically shows you a footprint of where your time gets spent across every application and every website, and gives you this weekly report showing here's where you spent your time last week. So we think, well, this would be a wonderful way to change our behavior, because if I just saw a mirror of my behavior, then maybe I would change. Turns out it's not true. It's because in general, again, with reflection, you have to show people their behavior in the context of the next choice that they're going to make. So if you just show them this deferred thing that's a report, it's just a report. It doesn't actually change behavior. It has to be integrated into the new moment of choice. And then another thing that makes a good relationship is to have it be value-centric, meaning does it care about your values and organize choices in terms of what you want? So the design principle is screens should organize choices by what matters to us. It should organize choices by the values that we hold for our lives and help frame choices in accordance with that. So what does that look like? So how many of you, you might be a little young for this, but some of you might be taking international flights, and let's say that you are, you book a flight on one of these websites, and you find yourself in an airport at around 11 o'clock at night in some random layover city for 4 hours, and you're thinking to yourself, why didn't I spend the extra $40 on the other flight? Right? It was $40. I'm here for 4 hours. Like, what am I really doing here? And Hipmunk is a travel website that realized this, that the people care about sorting by price, obviously, but they also sort about something else, which is what is flying really about? Is it just about price, or is it about human values, like the agony or the pleasure of a trip, right? And so again, we're only as good as the menus that we're given. And if you give someone a menu that organizes choices by the life experience it will create, that's a different way to think about the menu you're putting in front of someone. So ask the deeper question, what's the human value that this choice is really about? How would this choice affect someone's life? And frame the choice that way. Another example is, like, let's say you're booking a one-on-one with your boss in Google Calendar, and there's this little right-hand side meeting room selector. So what is a meeting room selector for? Well, you'd think it's for selecting a meeting room. But what is a room selector really for? Well, it's about what is the most fulfilling way for two people to catch up, right? Like, just imagine the global set of, like, if you were just to brainstorm for a second, I have a one-on-one with my boss, what would be the most fulfilling way for the two of us to catch up? And it might be taking a walking meeting. It might be, doing a little interactive charades exercise first, or a 5-minute meditation before we get started. Who knows? But how can the choices that we put in front of people honor what's at stake in that interaction? Or let's say you care about exercise, and let's say you could express that value that you care about that to various products. And so let's say you're in New York and you're searching for subway directions between work and Spring Street, and it gives you the 5 subway directions. And now in Google Maps, it shows you, like, the comparison with Uber, so you can see the cost of what it would take to just drive there. But what if you put also on Life's menu the fact that the person could walk, and you show them the calories they would burn, not because that's what any company was saying was good for them, but because they themselves said they want more exercise in their life, right? Like, as we're rapidly moving from menu to menu to menu, we're only as good as the way the menus present choices to us. Because we're cognitively limited. We can only see 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time. And so the features that we make salient in the choice architecture determine what people will do. Or, again, what if instead of caring about walking, you cared about, not walking or exercise, but let's say you cared about productivity and getting things done. Well, what if it said you could walk, and here's what that choice would be about. You could actually finish this podcast that you really wanted to finish. And it's a 35-minute walk, and you've got 28 minutes left. This is on your team to live by the values that you have for your life. So there's a second thing that's going on here too, which is that we're changing the design question that we're asking. Instead of asking the question, how do we help people get from point A to point B efficiently, which is a value that we automatically inherit, especially in Silicon Valley, where we create technologies created by engineers, and efficiency is the number one top promoted value behind most things we do. We're asking a different question, which is, how do we help people get from point A to point B well? What does that mean? Well, well is obviously going to be defined by them, but that's what I'm trying to hint at. So these are different aspects of what would make a relationship with the product more aligned, right? Where you're taking responsibility not just for the product, but for the relationship that the person has with it. I want to talk about one more thing in terms of the design, which is designing interpersonal relationships, because this is a big one. For anyone designing chat applications or email or messaging, where you're designing the relationship between two people. So let's walk through the quick example. And the metaphors for this come from marriage counseling. I won't get into that, but a lot of the influences here are, if you look at couples counseling and marriage counseling, there's a lot of really valuable stuff to look at from a design perspective, turns out. So let's take an example of interpersonal chat. So where does it break down? So you have these two people. Let's say you have Nancy on the left, and she's working on that document. And let's say you have John on the right, and he suddenly remembers, oh crap, I need to ask Nancy for that document right now before I forget, right? So when he has that thought, what happens? Well, he doesn't really have a choice. He needs to send her that message right now while he remembers. So what does he do? He sends her the message, and it blows away her attention, right? It just bulldozes her attention. And it turns out there's a serious cost to this. It takes us about 23 minutes on average to resume focus after any interruption. There's a woman named Gloria Mark at UC Irvine who's done research for the last 10 years on what she calls interruption science. And her research shows that it takes us about 23 minutes. We cycle through 2 different projects, usually in a break, before getting back to the original thing that we were doing. So these are knowledge workers, I believe at NASA, that she studied this with. The second thing her research shows is that it conditions people to self-interrupt more frequently. So what I mean by this is, if you take a person and you look at how much they got interrupted in an hour, The next hour, they're not interrupted, but their rate of self-interruption has gone up. So what appears to be happening, which she believes, and it's not totally proven yet, is that the more external interruptions we get, it's as if it's changing the internal clock rate of self-interruption. Right? But I don't know about you, but I, in my self-reflection of my behavior, feel this way. I feel like my self-interruption is quite high, and it goes up the more that I'm, distracted by other things. So how do you fix this? How would you fix this with design? Well, like a marriage counselor, what a marriage counselor does, or a couples counselor, is they take two people who may not be perfectly articulate at expressing their own preferences, and they're able to elicit the underlying preferences of both people, make the invisible visible, and then align this new visible set of preferences. So what would that look like with Nancy and John? So let's say the same situation again. There's Nancy on the left, John on the right. And let's say that Nancy this time can be invited to show that she has this preference for being focused while she's working on this document. So she did know that she wanted to be focused, but she didn't have a sense that she needed to be invited by the software to mark that she was focused. Let's say this could happen manually, or it could happen automatically by working on a certain project or opening up a certain application like a code editor or something like that. And now John still needs to interrupt Nancy to ask her for that document, right? So what does he do? He opens this window and he puts up this little message, except when he hits return, it holds the messages and queues them up and saying, we will send and deliver those messages to Nancy as soon as she's available again, because she's focused right now. So this gives this new choice to John, because he can now deliver the message and get on with what he's doing, and yet it doesn't have to interrupt Nancy right now. So we're done, right? Except you're thinking, I would never trust this because I'd be worried I'd miss something important, right? And you get around that by knowing, Nancy has to know that if there's something truly important, that the person could always escalate up a message, right? So if you just think about it, we're almost changing the default setting. So instead of by default, any message just goes through and bumps the person in the head, we basically switch from an accidental or unconscious interruption world to a conscious interruption. So interruptions still happen, but they're now consciously created. So let's see. Oh, sorry, this is another example. I'm going to skip this one actually, because I want to leave time for something else. This works with driving as well. Okay, so, but we did a second thing here again, which is we changed the design goal of chat, which is instead of saying, let's help people send a message efficiently, that the goal of chat should just be to deliver the message, to instead saying our design goal as the designers behind this product is to ask the question, how do we help people communicate with each other well? Now the reason this matters is if this was your design goal, just to help people communicate, or sorry, help people send messages efficiently, then if you're creating interruptions, it doesn't really matter because you're still following your goal, right? The interruptions, so far according to your goal, you're still doing your job. You've designed this thing, people are being sent messages efficiently, it's awesome. But it's not accounting for this other thing we care about too, which is interruption. So we upgraded the goal from just this transaction to the idea of what is communicating with each other about. It's about two people maybe understanding each other, respecting each other, having a sense of each other's needs or values, and communicating for that more human experience. So these were some design principles that have to do with attention. I just wanted to share some of them. And then what I really want to talk to you about is a new system. Because this is part of a much bigger conversation that we'll get into. So to open that conversation, there was a thing that I helped create about 1.5 years ago. If you don't know, this is Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh is a 90-year-old Zen Buddhist monk. And he's an international spokesperson for kind of mindfulness and meditation. He was nominated by Martin Luther King in 1969 for the Peace Prize. He's been involved in all sorts of things. He's written lots of books. You might have heard of him. And about 1.5 years ago, he came to Silicon Valley because he was very concerned about how technology was affecting people's attention and how it was affecting people's well-being. He's very, very concerned about it. And he gave this tour, giving talks about just mindfulness. And when he came to Google, the people who organized his visit knew about this sort of design ethics, attention ethics work that I was doing, and said, we will actually swap out an hour of his existing schedule and give an hour of his time to you if you can run around and find all the designers that you can. So it's really amazing. I got to basically run around Google and find the top designers I could. And we had the lead designers of Glass and Search and Android and some other people. And in a room, so imagine you go to a room one day at work, and there's this conference room like a normal day, except on one side of the conference room is just literally 9 brown-robed Buddhist monks on one side of the table, right? And on the other side are just a bunch of technology designers. And we had this talk about what are we really designing for? Are we designing just products? Are we designing just transactions? Or are we designing essentially people's attentional lives? Are we designing something deeper? And I always mention this example, but as something that came up as a joke, he said in our conversation, what if instead of a spell check, you had a compassion check? Meaning, could you highlight words in yellow that might be accidentally understood as abrasive by the other person? Not because you're trying to coerce people, but just to make people more aware. And again, it goes from upgrading the goal of a communication client from just being about delivering a message to asking, how can we enable the most compassionate or honest or real communication that we can? So, does this kind of conversation happen outside of just design meetings with monks? One of my favorite examples about this topic is couch surfing. Do you guys know what couch surfing is? It was predated Airbnb. It's actually bigger than Airbnb up until about a year ago, I think. And couch surfing is a free sharing economy of free space. So if you have an extra couch in your apartment in Palo Alto, you can put it up on Couchsurfing, and international travelers who are looking for a place to stay can find you and then stay with you for free. And it operates entirely on this reputation economy. It's a great service. So if you went to work and you're designing Couchsurfing, what do you think your goal might be? You might think that the goal would be, well, if there's someone looking for a place to stay, the goal metric would be, did they find a place to stay, right? Did they find a host? But here's where it gets interesting, because that goal would kind of be like our other goals. It would be like the transactional goal of chat, where we're just delivering a message, or it would be like the transactional goal of the transportation example, where we're just trying to get someone from point A to point B. Because the actual goal that they set for themselves is that they want to create a lasting positive experience between two people who've never met. So they said our goal is not just to match the transaction, not just that two people connected. We care about people having a positive, lasting experience. And the way they did that is they came up with a metric, which is brilliant, and a really good friend of mine named Joe Edelman came up with it. And the way it works is essentially you have two people. Let's say there's two people and they're meeting up and they're in Paris or something like that. And let's say they spend 4 days together. So what they do to create this metric, is they say, for two people who are meeting, how many days did they spend together? So they get the number of days that two people spent. So they take 4 days, and then what they do is they say how many hours occurred in those days. So they estimate how many hours would have been created in this interaction between two people. And then they ask both people, how positive were those hours? So what you're getting is a count of positive hours, okay? And then what they do is they subtract from that all of the time that people spent on Couchsurfing in hours. So what you're left with is just this new set of positive hours, which they call net orchestrated conviviality, or the net good times that are created between two people who've never met. And these are hours that would have never existed if Couchsurfing didn't exist. Do you get that? Like, it's so cool, right? Like, they measure their success in terms of new hours on the planet that two people count as positive contributions to their lives that otherwise would have never existed unless Couchsurfing did what they did today. So when you think of this as an example, it's almost like a gross national happiness kind of metric, right? Can you imagine a whole world that worked that way, right? Can you imagine if every service you used, if every technology you used had a metric that would basically counted success in terms of net positive contribution to your life? And they measure themselves that way. So instead of dating services that count their success in terms of swipes left and right, which is currently like 1 billion a day, what if like Tinder measured their success in terms of the number of people who found what they were looking for, right? and didn't just try to maximize swipes per day? What if a professional network like LinkedIn, instead of counting success in terms of connections that were added between two people, like engagement metrics, or how much time people spent, or how many messages got sent, what if they measured the number of people who found jobs that they were glad to get? Just the jobs they were glad to get, right? Because that's what, I mean, or whatever people find fulfilling out of LinkedIn, but the net positive contribution to their life. So you can imagine, like, what if the whole world was totally on your team to help you live according to what mattered to you? But to do that, you're probably thinking we also need a new system, because our current system is measured on time spent. The way that you raise funding from the venture capitalists on Sand Hill, a few blocks from here, is you show them your success or your growth in terms of time spent. You show them, I have more usage today than I had yesterday. I have more users. They're logging in more often. I get them to stay longer, right? So this is going against that. It's a different metric. So how would this work? Well, you'd have to do it like we've done it in other industries, where we said we have to value these actors in a different way. We did that once with organic, right? Where we said, prior to organic, in agriculture, there was this race to the bottom of the cheapest price, right? So if there's two farmers trying to make apples, and they're putting them out there, and one farmer says, you know, I don't want to put pesticides on my apple, without the label organic, he's just a 75-cent apple, and his competitors are a 25-cent apple. So no one's going to buy the 75-cent apple. But when they say, no, 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 this is a different kind of apple, it's an organic apple, then people can value it differently. It can be valued in a different way. It's just like the B Corp movement, if you know about that. Or LEED certification, where we said this is a building that's not just about the cheapest price or the best situation. It's about the green values that stand behind the building. What kind of sustainability certification does it follow? And how do we value it differently by giving it a kind of label? Well, what if we had something like that for technology, where the actors could be labeled and measured in terms of their net positive contribution to people's lives, so that they were rewarded for caring about you? And the reason I'm here is because this is not a conversation that we're having right now, right? We're having this, we sort of invisibly live in this attention economy, and everyone's competing for attention, and we should start asking the question, is this good, right? Are we creating the net positive contribution in people's lives that we want to? And doing that would amount to moving from an entire economy that's measuring success on time spent to one that's measuring success on time well spent. And that's what I want to leave you with before we open up for questions, which is 15 minutes. So thanks.
All right. Feel free to jump in, raise hands, or just shout out. Make sure your questions are well spent.
A lot of questions. Sorry.
So, I've got a couple teenagers, and I'm always, my son doesn't like to watch like a movie with me because he wants to sit there with his computer also, like a lot of people here are doing. He wants to do two things, and I'm like, well, you're not watching the movie. You're not getting the enjoyment of watching the movie if you're sitting there with your computer, and I think that's the better way to watch it, is just watch the movie. Sure enough, now I find myself watching, sitting there with my phone and playing my whatever, and I'm like, no, this is what I've been telling them I don't want to do. So, I just so get what you're saying here. It's just so addictive, and I've now changed. It's like my value that I had, which is just watch the movie, do one thing, and do it enjoyably well. I find, well, now kind of I'm enjoying like doing 2 or 3 things instead of just watching the movie, and I'm unhappy with the way it's going.
Yes.
Right.
Well, I think one of the just to be really clear, because some of you might think that there's a normative argument here that I'm saying that like monotasking is the only way, or people shouldn't do this, or they should do this. That's not what's going on here. The idea is just, what do we feel good about on retrospect? Like, some of our behavior, some of the things we do with technology, we feel great about it later. But like you're saying, some things just don't feel good, and we wish we weren't doing that as much. And we're not saying that we should stop people from doing that. We're just saying, how could technology be more on your team when you feel that way, so that you get the behavior that you want? And recognize that we're in this sort of it takes two to tango type relationship, and we need some help. More questions?
So you mentioned instead of doing things more efficiently, try to do it in better, decide well. But how do you find out what the users might want? And also, as you said, there's also a difference of what the users might want now versus what the users might want for themselves later on. So when you decide, how do you get that kind of feedback? Because in a sense, it's a more creative process.
Right. Well, so the reason, so it's a great question. I think right now there's an underrepresented. We have a very narrow idea of what a user wants. The way that Valley tends to treat what people want is just what you click on. So if what you click on a lot is what we treat that as what you want. So if you come to an app really frequently, we assume that's what you want, as opposed to that's a kind of a I'm seizuring out and my thumb is just hitting stuff, right? The distinction I wanted to create of the Netflix example is just that there's a more holistic picture of a user. And that if you sample at the moment that they're doing something versus right after they did something versus retrospectively looking back on their behavior, you get different answers, right? But to do that, we have to have a different model of self, where instead of seeing a user as one person with static preferences, we have to acknowledge, not that we have a problem, but just that we're different people at different times. And that the person that we become is partly the invitation that's created by our environment. So as designers, we're creating the invitation that causes one person or one set of preferences to emerge, and we could do better to get a more holistic sense. So one of the projects that we wanted, this is sort of an independent, by the way, this Time Well Spent project, like an organic label for tech. One of the projects is actually to collect that retrospective signal. So how do people feel on retrospect? After a week looking back in a industry standard mirror version of their behavior, some people feel wonderful about their use of certain things, and some people feel like part of their use they wish they didn't do. So that's not a direct answer to your question, but that's more like that's the conversation to create.
Some kind of user surveys.
Yeah, so you could do surveys. I mean, so Couchsurfing actually does an initial follow-up of asking you to rate on different variables, and they get a pretty high response rate because the people who use Couchsurfing are actually part of a community and they view it as their responsibility to do it. It's run on a reputation economy. The second thing that they do is they confirm. So if you say that you stayed in Paris for 4 days and you had this positive rating now, 6 months later they ask you again, actually. And they just say, did you still feel like that was valuable? And what they found is like some of people's most rewarding experiences on Couchsurfing were things that they didn't feel good about in the moment, but felt really good about later. And I think like this conversation is opening up a much bigger topic, which is what's the moral North Star of design? Is it happiness? Are we just trying to put smiles on people's faces for their whole life? Or are we trying to create a meaningful experience? And what is meaning? Well, it's not just that on retrospect people feel great. I mean, there's this balance between in the moment positive experience, immediately after positive experience, and then retrospective positive experience. So it's a much bigger conversation, and it deals with psychology and behavioral economics and a bunch of other fields that are looking at the way that our subjective perception of what feels good changes across time. Sorry.
So I'm wondering if there's a more active way that's through a device that we're using to correct our habit. Because sometimes when speak of addiction, it can be good as habits, or bad as like really bad addiction. For example, for myself, I like reading all the tech news. I'm always like thinking, I would like more. But on the other hand, on the other extreme, there's like I'm compelled to read more because I'm addicted to like Facebook feed. So then through a device we can sense the human, the heartbeat. So that's the feeling of anxiety, but that's the feeling of excitement. But they're on a different extreme. So I'm wondering if there's a way that we can use our device, like make the device smarter to sense the human emotion, therefore to help correct your habit.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people who are thinking about that and concerned about that and using. So you guys understand basically finding different ways of extracting a signal that's implicit, whether it's galvanic skin response or heart rate variability or stress or something like that. I'm very interested in that. I would like to see more people, try. These things get really tricky, right? Because if you do it wrong, then you come off as a nanny, and you're saying, don't do this thing that you want to do. And so if you're ever wrong or saying you're stressed out, when I'm like, no, I'm not, just let me do what I'm doing, right? There's this tricky thing where you have to, it's subtle the way that you have to bring people. So I'm not sure how optimistic I am about those things, but I think they should be researched and looked into for sure. You had a question, sorry.
So it seems like this obsession about getting users to spend time and to kind of look for the new things is fueled a lot by an advertising business model. And I'm wondering to what extent can these design principles kind of exist if it's advertising driven, or whether we really need to think of a different business model to encourage more kind of meaningful design.
Yeah, It's a great question. So, time spent as a metric for success. So it used to just be impressions, like page views. So just like, did people land on pages? Did people land on rectangles? And then recently, the metric has evolved to be more specifically about engagement. There's two reasons for that. One is that engagement serves as a proxy for people liking something. So if the engagement is up, it's not that it's making more money from that, but it's a proxy for value. People are loyal or value this app or this service more because they're spending a lot of time on it. The problem is when people mistake the proxy for the real thing, like that especially in large organizations where you have thousands of people just optimizing to metrics, then the kind of reason behind the metric, the fact that it was a proxy for something else, that gets lost. And instead, people's bonus depends on increasing that metric from what it is now to what it needs to be. So that's one. So one reason is this sort of proxy for how much people value things. That's because that's how investors look at it, the public stock market looks at it, things like that. The other side is to do with time spent based advertising, in which by squeezing out more minutes from people's lives looking at rectangles, you can always make a little bit more money. And that sets up a little bit of a perverse incentive, right? So I think it calls into question, there's different ways of dealing with that. Existing forms of advertising can become more profitable, and we can decide that we just don't want to undoubtedly grow on time spent and suck people's time away. But I think that there's a deeper thing going on here, which is that the products that sit between you and these things that demand your attention could do a better job of helping you spend your time the way you want to. If that makes sense. So specifically, a browser and a mobile phone are non-conflict of interest platforms, and they sit between you and all the websites that you browse, and they sit between you and all the apps that want your attention, and they can help you sort your attention more according to what you care about. Does that make sense?
It does, but they're currently funded by advertising, which is usually a distracting way from what you want to do.
Well, no, but the home screens on mobile phones are not funded by advertising, and browsers are not funded by advertising, right? I mean, they serve different strategic purposes.
I see.
Right? Like, for example, there's ads on Gmail, there's not ads on the new version of Inbox, and people think that, that's because there needs to be, to extract money from every page view of a Gmail ad or something like that, and it's not usually the way it seems. But you had a question?
Yeah. Correct me if I don't understand this correctly. So time well spent, for me, a big part of it means building healthy habits, good habits. But a lot of times, good habits are hard to build. It's just like when you go to the gym, it's just really hard for you to get there. But after the exercise, you always feel good. And in BJ Fogg model, the harder it is, the harder something is, the harder it is for people to take action to do it.
Right.
I'm wondering what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so for example, there's probably, and I don't mean to focus the conversation on apps, but there's probably some app out there that's really good at putting people into a, people who want to work out more, into a local group that goes twice a week, like a walking group or a gym group or something like that. But that app today would not get rewarded by app stores, wouldn't get a lot of downloads because it doesn't spread virally, wouldn't get a lot of funding from venture capitalists, wouldn't be able to hire the best teams, wouldn't get the press, so no one would know about it. And so it's systematically under-rewarded by the economy, even if it was really good at helping people get to the gym. So what you would want is a review that says, this thing is really good, not at just being an app that works well, but it's really good at actually achieving the outcome of helping people go to the gym. This is still hypothetical, but let's say there is this app that's really good at putting people into some group and getting people to the gym. This review would help put premium shelf space up so that app can be rewarded for doing good. As opposed to today, where it's measured on this time spent thing, it's not going to be rewarded. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Here's a follow-up question. How is this concept being received in Google internally? Would Play Store potentially do something like that?
This is super early. This is not Google. This is just independent, ideas. But people in Google, I think, care about these values a lot, and it's super early. I think the reason I'm here is to create more of a public conversation that's a consumer-driven conversation so that there's more demand for something like this, because until there's that demand, it's hard to prioritize it from a big company perspective. Yeah.
So near the end, you put together this contrast where you were talking about maximizing these long-term relationships as opposed to sort of the twitchy goals like swipes.
Mm-hmm.
And I can easily see outcomes where maybe we sit and we think about it and we run some numbers and we realize that the best way to actually maximize the number of long-term relationships is to maximize the twitchiness.
Right.
And so what do we do in that kind of scenario, right?
Yeah.
It's like we are helping more people be happier, but we are sort of burning through a lot of people potentially in the meantime.
Totally, yeah. This is like a consequentialist ethics. So it's like if the outcome of all the twitchiness does get you that, then should you do it?
Right.
I think more important than that is just that people aren't even having that conversation right now. They don't view it as a trade-off, as opposed to just it just must be good for people. So there tends to be a lack of consciousness about creating the twitchiness. The twitchiness is counted as success, or is counted as making the world more open and connected, or is counted as creating long-term relationships, when it's not necessarily that. So I know it's sort of a cop-out answer, but I think there's different ways of thinking about systems like that. Like you could be given some allowance or some like initial, there's sort of an initial period where we message you more or something like that, and then there's like a cap-off rate.
Marriages per Twitch or something like this.
What's that?
Marriages per swipe or something like this.
So, I don't know, something, or a period where you amp it up more, right? Because like for dating, for example, let's take that example. So people need to set a pool of people that they're matching with frequently. You have to get a big enough pool that you can then find some people for them. So there's probably some initial period where you can ask more of them, and then once you have that pool, you can do better to then like actually get them out to meet those people. Right. More questions? There.
I'm guessing that everybody in this room would turn on your hypothetical Google features like right now if we could, because this is a big problem at Stanford with email overload and time management.
Right.
How can we all express our support for the things you're talking about?
Awesome. Sorry, yes, okay. So, no, it was not. That was awesome, actually. And it's so great to hear that. Are you guys, I came here because this is like literally a public conversation trying to recruit help from people. So one thing we're doing is there's a redesign day where we're going to redesign a bunch of screens, and according to some of the design principles you saw here, and actually a different methodology that my collaborator in Berlin who's coming into town for. So on April 25th, it's on a Saturday, there's a Facebook event that's linked there. You can check that out. What we want to do is basically it's almost like a lower cost way of showing the world that different kinds of screens could exist. And we can show people that there's a different way that email could be designed, that a home screen could be designed. If I had more time, I'd show you some of those examples. But that's one way. The other thing is this, let's see. Anyway, this timewellspent.io, there's a place to add your email. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone coordinating and organizing the different ways to get people involved, but there's a bunch of different projects. One is we'd like to create an independent certification like organic, so for different kinds of categories of platforms, whether it's browsers, you follow a certain set of criteria. If you're a home screen, there's a certain set of criteria you can follow. If you're a notification type screen, there's a different set of criteria you could follow. So trying to create more common standards. There's this reviews database where we basically gather long-term reviews, retrospective reviews of what people find time well spent for different values. So we need engineering and other help with that. These are the early stages of these projects. So if you're interested to get involved, actually come talk to me afterwards as well. But this is another place you can add your name. And there's a TED Talk that has a lot of this content on it, and it's on this website. So another thing you can do is just share that and create more conversation with people around you if you want a lightweight way of getting involved. If you're going off into a company after this, like ask the question to the people you're working with. Bring these issues up, right? A lot of people here are either interning or going to be working or are working now at many of these companies, and you can bring up this conversation and have a different conversation about it. A lot of this stuff was in a Wisdom 2.0 talk that has more detail. The TED Talk's a little bit more fluffy, so if you want to share that one, they're on my website, and they're good conversation starters.
Excellent. Why don't we thank our speaker one more time?
Cool.